Good morning, everyone. Welcome today. Lots of challenging videos we've seen, isn't it? I think by popular request, we'll have a lot of them be shown again in the next day or two, so watch out for that. We're a little low on numbers, but I know that numbers also trickle in. You can start at 11 and they'll still trickle in. You can start at 10 or 9 and they'll still trickle in. So hopefully quality, not quantity, is what we need. So let me just start off by pay my respects to the Mparntwe people on whose land we meet here in Mparntwe. It's such a privilege to be on this country. I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and to all First Nations people in the audience, thanking them for their immense grace towards us in meeting on their country. Just to introduce myself, I'm Richard Eckard. I'm another one of the professors from the University of Melbourne. My background is really in carbon farming and been involved in a lot of the offset methods that have been developed over time, and now involved in the review of the offset methods to see where we went wrong. You probably noticed a slight accent. I'm actually from Swaziland, Eswatini. My Zulu name is Nongawazime, which is the tall Zulu. But I now live on the lands of the Wurundjeri people in east of Melbourne. So that's me. So this session we have 6 speakers, so a fairly tight session. We'll try and keep to about 15 minutes per session to allow us some dialogue, some yarn at the end to bring it together. So the session we're looking at is a theme around exploring loss and damage, knowledge to actions. So we've got an exciting lineup of talks on climate change adaptation from an IPCC perspective, from a First Nations perspective, around fire, around water, and resource management. So full program. So we'll start off by introducing our first speaker, Professor Mark Howden, who's the director of the Institute for Climate and Energy Disaster Solutions, Australian National University. Mark is also an honorary professor at our university, Melbourne University. So, but Mark's quite a notable scientist internationally, being the vice chair of the IPCC Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, including chair of the Australian Capital Territory Climate Change Council. I won't go through all the other international roles, not the least of which is advising the US government. I presume that wasn't the Trump era. It would have been before the Trump era, yeah, because things went a bit pear-shaped in that period. Mark's worked on climate variability, climate change, innovation, adoption over about 30 years in partnership with industry and governments. Just an anecdote, Mark. You told me the other day, anyone aware of the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 carbon accounting structure? Mark came up with that idea at the IPCC, so you can blame him for that. No, very, very useful. I was trying to think of some other anecdotes, but I run out. Mark, over to you.
Thanks, Richard. It's really great to be here again, and I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people. That's where I come from, down in Canberra. So I'm giving a really quick talk here, just talking about climate adaptation from an IPCC perspective. So Djarra is going to talk about the much more detailed, sort of localized sort of options that are available for people in these regions. And so maybe it's the other way. I don't know. Yeah, okay, it's not working, but here we go. So, so just before I start on sort of the climate adaptation story, there's a fundamental question: why would we bother to adapt? Why would we bother to respond to climate change? And just to give you a feel for this, this is a table of climate impacts. So we adapt to these impacts. And what you can see from this table, which I won't go into detail because it's too much information there, but you can see that this is arrayed by different regions. So there's a global element, there's different continents, and there's different other regions such as mountainous regions. And then in the vertical columns, you can see different climate impacts. So some of those impacts are on food and water systems, some of them are on health and well-being, some of them are on infrastructure and urban systems. And under each of those cells, you know, the combination of region and system, you can see an evaluation based on the scientific literature where the climate change impacts were negative. So it's got a little dash in there, where they were sort of a mix of negative and positive. So you see the plus and the minus there, or if they were positive, only positive. And you can see from this diagram that there is no single cell on this diagram that is simply positive, where the climate change only has positive impacts. At best, you get a mix, but most of the cells have negative impacts. And increasingly what that scientific analysis shows is that these impacts are large, they are net negative, as I said, and they're really significant in terms of global functioning, whether it's in terms of food or water or floods and extreme events. And so as a consequence, the logical consequence of this is, again, I'm not sure, here we go, that we need to have an adaptation response which is similarly large, operating very quickly because the impacts are already here, and also also in a sense net positive, you know, so we want to take a positive agenda to the adaptation responses. Now, you can see here what the adaptation definition is from the IPCC. Essentially, it's just in human systems, it's the process of adjustment to anticipated or actual climate changes. In natural systems, it's essentially the inherent responses of those systems to the changing interventions of climate. So if we can go to the next one. And really importantly, as we emerge from a decade of politics, particularly around Canberra, which couldn't put the words climate and change together in a sentence, so it was often euphemistically termed climate variability. There is a fundamental difference in managing climate variability and managing climate change. So managing climate variability is backwards looking at frames variability as essentially a static thing. It's a risk of variation around the average. Climate change means your average is changing, but also the degree of variation around that average can be changing. So we're seeing, for example, more extreme events. So that variation is increasing. So we have to move from that old framing, you know, related to politics, into a framing which is much more appropriate, which is actually about responding to climate change. And if we just focus on tweaking our existing systems, we often result in maladaptation. And we can also miss out on opportunities, because there are opportunities that can arise from climate change. They may be patchy and niche, but nevertheless, there can be opportunities, such as grape growers moving down to Tasmania and earning a lot of money out of that change. So it was a climate change induced response and adaptation, but it's also delivering value right now as well as value out into the future. And the little bottom diagram there is just emphasizing that when we think about adaptation, it's really important to think about the full range of possibilities, tweaking your existing systems through to transformational change. And in the end, you may actually say, well, tweaking our existing systems is the best thing to do, but it's the rigor of going through that analysis that's really important. So you actually look at all of the options available and then choose the one that's most appropriate to your context. Next slide. So here's a diagram from the IPCC, which just looks at what we call that maladaptation to adaptation continuum. So like everything that humans do, we don't always do it well. And so there are possibilities for maladaptation, that's responding inappropriately or too soon or too late, or having unintended consequences of different types. And again, without going into detail, but this slide is available later, it just talks about that continuum in terms of things like benefits to humans, benefits to natural systems. Does it improve equity outcomes or make those worse? Does it actually open up for transformation potential, or does that block that off in future if we want to do it? And does, of course, it reduce greenhouse gas emissions? Because we don't want an adaptation response that increases greenhouse gas emissions, because it just makes the situation worse. Next slide. Now, one of the things that has I think, often bugged stakeholders who we engage with and really annoyed them is we've taken a very science approach to adaptation in the past, and we've done what I call the climate-centered approach, which is you put the climate information at the center of inquiry and as the dominant part of the inquiry, and then you attach different systems of importance around that. and you work out then as a small part of a project, well, what your adaptation responses are within those systems. If we go to the next slide, then I would argue, and I think we're sort of moving towards what I call a much more decision-centric or values-centric arrangement, which is actually you start off, thanks very much. You start off with the values and aspirations of those people who are involved. From that, then you look at the different ways in which systems of concern are impacted by climate, and then you look for specific climate information that informs those decisions and values and supports them. It's a fundamentally inverted way of looking at adaptation, and it's a much more outcomes-oriented way, and it's a much more stakeholder-friendly way because it allows them to be engaged in co-design in that process. Now, again, IPCC diagram, this one, which I'll zoom in on, is associated with the range of possible adaptations that were brought together by the IPCC. So thousands of different scientific studies which looked at adaptation responses to climate change in different sectors. And this is the one associated with water and land that I've got on the screen. And again, without going into a lot of detail, what we looked at in relation to adaptation was we assessed the feasibility of adaptation responses according to different criteria. So there's economic and technological criteria, there's social criteria, institutional capacity to implement adaptation, environmental and other criteria there as well. And for each of these aggregate adaptation options on the left, so forest-based adaptation, etc., they were assessed against those criteria. So really important to look at this from a multi-dimensional perspective. There's no single criteria which is important in any given situation, and then aggregated those. And so that's the second dark column the first dark column of circles there. So that gives sort of an aggregate view of the feasibility of different adaptations. And next to it is the synergies with emission reduction with mitigation. So in each case, we assessed whether those adaptations would also lead to reduced greenhouse gas emissions. So having a more integrated or comprehensive approach to the arrangements. Now, when we actually looked at this, it's important to sort of, when we looked at this, there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of ways of adapting different systems. And each system has different adaptation options, and they can vary in different contexts. And so there's a huge range of possible adaptations that are available to people in different ways to achieve different goals. And so there's in a sense, there's a job there to actually select the ones which are appropriate. Every one of those adaptations, if you're going to implement it, you implement it because you actually think you're going to be better off than you would otherwise be. So adaptation is fundamentally a positive message. It's actually saying, if you adapt to climate change, you'll be better off than you would otherwise be. There is absolutely no logic to taking on board an adaptation where you expect to be worse off. That would be way, way down the maladaptation spectrum. No one logically is going to do that. So adaptations are always done in the expectation of benefits, even if those benefits aren't necessarily realized because of poor choices or poor implementation. One of the other things which is really important about adaptation responses is that it actually empowers people. It actually enables people to feel that they're taking control of their future, that they're responding to things which are happening to them. And as a result, that measurably reduces stress in those people who are actually engaged in adaptation activities, and it empowers them about thinking strategically about the future. So adaptation has a lot of other benefits apart from sort of the material ones that can actually significantly influence people's attitudes and ability to make good decisions. And that's right. So, but you're better off than you would otherwise be, given the changes. So it's not saying that climate change is going to be rosy, but by adapting effectively, you can take the sting out of some of the negatives, and you can sometimes build up the positives. So instead of a small positive, you can make it a bigger positive. And so it's not to paint a rose-colored, rosy sort of picture on this. It's actually to just be very clear that this is about risk management. It's not about risk removal. And lastly, of course, we have to address limits to adaptation, barriers to adaptation, often institutional ones, and also that linkage to emission reductions. And the last slide that I think is on my slide set is just really important to link these adaptations in, not just to the climate change agenda, but also to the Sustainable Development Goals agenda. So across the world, we've got most governments actually signed up to the Sustainable Development Goals. There's 17 different goals there. So that's the sort of colours down the bottom right. And you know, and I don't expect you to read all of this, but the impression that I want you to get from this is that there's an immense amount of congruence between effective adaptation responses and meeting those Sustainable Development Goals. So it's not just about dealing with climate change as a silo, it's actually how you integrate this with sustainable development at a global scale. And so it's a key sort of message, I think, coming from the IPCC, that is this is actually part of that broader agenda. Essentially, we can't have sustainable development without dealing with climate change, and we can't deal with climate change without having sustainable development. So it's a flip-sided sort of view of life. They're integrated together. And the last sort of slide here is, okay, that's the picture of what we could do. How well are we doing it? And this italicized part on the top is essentially a quote, slightly edited quote for length, coming out of the IPCC, which says, unfortunately, most observed adaptation, that's things we're actually doing right now, is fragmented, it's small in scale, it's incremental, so it's on that left-hand side of that incremental to transformational range. It's very sector specific, and that's designed to respond to near-term risks and current impacts rather than the future impacts that we're expecting. And so, and a lot of it is focused on the planning, the talking rather than the doing, the implementation. So the assessment is there's lots and lots we could do here, but various limitations are preventing us from doing it right across the globe. And one of those is finance. So the IPCC assessed that of all of the climate finance across the globe, most of it is actually being spent on emission reduction. About 7 to 8% is actually being spent on adaptation. So it's a grossly disproportionate amount which is actually going to that goal. And of that, a tiny amount is actually going to the sort of social and psychological elements which are actually fundamental to implementation. So a question that I'd ask is, here in Australia, is our research and development arrangements appropriate? And at the moment, I'd say no. We've actually massively disinvested in climate adaptation over the last decade, and we don't have a big agenda to build that up. In fact, most of the work on climate adaptation research that we see in Australia is actually focused on essentially technical rather than dealing with the really big issues, which are the social and social psychological aspects, the institutional and the political aspects. And so much of our work actually misses the mark in terms of maximum effectiveness. And I'd also ask a question about whether our institutions are appropriate. So many of our institutions silo issues rather than integrate issues, and they tend to exclude other knowledges rather than include other knowledges. And so we're not actually bringing the best of our ability to bear in terms of this challenge that's ahead of us. So I'll just leave it there, but happy to answer questions about this when the time comes.
Great, thank you, Mel.